There's also a view options where it'll change the size of the window.
Okay.
That still doesn't give you your. If you had to do it like that, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. If you're okay with other people seeing your notes, but
yeah. And pull that down anyway. Maybe if I do that, nope. So right now, all you can see on my screen is just the PowerPoint window, right? You can't see all the other windows. Okay, that's what I.
Is that what you want?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I think I have another way to do this.
I can still only see the slides.
All right, let me see if I, nope, that didn't work. Okay, then that's just how we're gonna have to do it.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and, oh, actually we did start it. So people are coming in now. I'm gonna go ahead and share this to Facebook as well.
Drew, can the attendees, what can they see now? Have we started?
Yep, we're started. They can see us. As attendees start to come online, just hang tight and we're gonna start in just a minute.
Is everybody ready to get started? Chris, you ready? Give me a thumbs up. Or... Okay, great. I'm Scott Gustafson. I'm the administrator here at the ECM, and I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us this evening or for watching this event on Facebook or watching it on the ECM YouTube channel in the future. So again, thank you for attending University-Community Forum. This is an event that the ECM has been hosting since the 1940s. We've typically held these in person, but now we are doing them online temporarily. This is the 4th online event that we've held, and Community Forum is we typically invite people from around the Lawrence and University of Kansas communities, but fortunately, because of the online format, we are able to invite folks from around the country. And this evening's speaker, Chris Lazaro, lives in San Antonio. So we're looking forward, more Community Forum events in the next few weeks. I think we'll have the spring semester's schedule up, hopefully, at the beginning of the year. That's beginning to fill out. And some other programming notes for the ECM. We have a daily Instagram Live show called In Cahoots with the ECM, which is kind of like Community Forum, but only 15 minutes. So I'd recommend checking those out as well for a little bit shorter conversations. And the ECM is a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you'd like to support the ECM and make a contribution, at the end of the year is always a good time for that, and it would be tax deductible. And then with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Chris Lazaro. Chris is an urban planner who, like I said, lives in San Antonio. And he has a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Texas A&M. And he's recently published a book called Faith in Cities, which we'll be hearing about this evening. And speaking to Chris before this, looking for any other information that he wanted me to share with everyone, he told me that he's left-handed. So I feel like he's holding back the good stuff. So with that, I'll welcome Chris.
Hey, thank you for having me on. It's definitely an honor to be one of the few that can join from outside of the Lawrence area. So thank you for that. And I, as an independenter, I have to do the shameless plug. I think that's showing up backwards on your screens. But anyway, Faith in Cities came out earlier this year. That was a project that was about 5 years in the making almost. And so I'm really excited to be here and hopefully share a little bit of what I've learned in the process of writing this book, and hopefully inspire some questions throughout our time. And if you have questions after the event, you can certainly reach me on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram actually as well. So without further ado, we can jump on in, and I look forward to hearing any questions at the end of this. Let's see if I can get to the next slide here. There we go. So really the central question behind Faith in Cities is, what if it doesn't just matter how we live, but also where? I think particularly if you're a person of faith, we talk a lot about the how we live. What do we do to be better? What should we abstain from? There's a lot of talk, especially in religious groups, about the do's and don'ts of religion, but we don't really talk as much about other factors related to our faith, and particularly the impact of where we live or where we work, where we just do our lives on a day-to-day basis. And so that was something that I'd really wrestled with for a long time, feeling as though God really does have something to say about our communities. And so that was something that I decided to explore through this book. And so, I think where I would probably start is, I don't know if you all are like me, where I was just fascinated with cities as a kid. I know that lots of people like to play SimCity, for example, or, build with Legos, that kind of thing. And going into this project, I came from it with this mindset of really loving cities and the built environment, the form of the ways that our cities are built. And that was really what I thought this book would ultimately be about, is, how does Christianity line up with the physical built environment? And while that is certainly an aspect of this book, I think what I came to realize through this process is that cities are really much more about what's in between the buildings. It's the people, it's the spaces that we walk around, that we drive through, all of these places. And that, when I realized that it was more than, that cities are more than just a collection of buildings, that they really are expressions of ourselves, I think that really opened a huge opportunity, I think, in this book that I hope resonates with some of you. And so there's a lot of things, of course, I could cover, but I don't want to, of course, summarize the entire book during this short time. So there are a few things that I really wanted to kind of highlight. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of the American dream and how that really relates to how we think about our places, how our communities function. And then I want to later tie in how faith plays into that. So when we think about, the American dream, and, I know probably this audience tends to be on the younger side, certainly younger than I am. And I think, that term American dream sounds as though it's something that our parents' generation tends to have strived for, things like the house with the picket fence and, 2 cars in the garage and all of those kinds of things, the 2.5 kids, etc. And, while that dream might look very different for people in the millennial and Gen Z generations, I think the underlying factors really in this dream are about individualism. They're about meritocracy. Even in where the term American dream was originally coined, there's a quote, it's each according to his ability or achievement. And I think that very much embodies the American ethic, and that really had a much deeper effect on the way that our cities and our neighborhoods were built ever since the 1930s and onward. And really, home ownership became that cornerstone of the American dream, as we all know. But more than it just being something that was always inherently in us, it's not part of our DNA, but really this dream of home ownership in America was designed, it was engineered. Policies at the federal level prioritized home ownership over the way that we had lived for the rest of human history. And really everything followed suit from that. So we look at, advertising, magazines and television that emerged that all play into this idea of home. 100 years ago, the idea that we would have entire television networks and websites all dedicated to making our homes a reflection of our identity is very foreign. And, I think we tend to forget that in the age of fixer-upper and all of these things, right? The idea of celebrity as lifestyle. I mean, everybody that's anybody has released some type of home goods or furniture line. I mean, everyone from Sofia Vergara to Snoop Dogg, they've all released furniture and candles and all of these kinds of things. And so this has really become fully embedded into society and into our culture here in the US. And, you know, home ownership really and automobile culture grew both simultaneously and symbiotically. So, you know, as detached housing became the default more and more after World War II, car ownership also became much more appealing. You know, as factories grew, you know, cars became much more attainable for middle-income families. And so as those two things came into being at about the same time, then the design of the home also had to respond. It incorporated the vehicle. As we know now, most new homes that are built today have some type of attached garage, whether you're talking, you know, the single family house in the suburbs that we kind of think about, but even, you know, apartment dwellings in the city, you know, a lot of times those buildings will even have attached parking as well. And so that really, in a very brief kind of brushstroke, kind of shows us about this rise of the American dream. But that American dream has had an impact. And so that's something that I dive deeper into in this book. And there are, you know, I would say for the purpose of this conversation, probably 4 key areas that American dream has really impacted here in our society and in our culture. And the first of those being mobility. If we think about how much traffic is something that we always like to talk about, how terrible it is in our communities, maybe not so much in Lawrence, but certainly here in San Antonio, it's pretty bad. The cycle of car dependency, you know, I think we tend to underestimate how much the design of our communities forces us into owning a vehicle. And that type of cycle where things are further apart, and then we need a car because they're further apart, but because we have all these cars, now things need to be even further apart. That has a disproportionate impact on the poor because, you know, according to AAA, I think the cost of owning a vehicle is somewhere around $9,000 or $10,000 a year now. And if you are a minimum wage full-time worker, that's 50% of your income just in transportation. And that's not really tenable for families that are earning that little. And, you know, not only do we create this cycle of auto dependency and it has this impact on the poor, it also hasn't necessarily delivered on the promise of freedom that was sold to us during the kind of early years of cars. So for example, the US population has doubled since 1950, but the energy that we use in our homes and transportation has more than tripled during that same time period. So there's an impact there. But all the while, our commute times haven't gone down, they've gone up, even though we continue to spend record amounts of money on freeway expansions, roadway widenings, all of these things. And we're widening our roads faster than our population is growing, and it isn't solving the problem. And it's certainly not solving the problem for our more vulnerable neighbors. And beyond that, the second impact is really on health, and all of these things are connected. We think about all the air pollution, of course, that comes from all of that added stress on our travel system. And, you know, I guess one thing you could say about me that besides being left-handed is that I have asthma. I've grown up with it from the time I was very little. And you know, during my childhood, air quality was much worse than it is today. And so this is something that is very relevant to me personally. And I'm sure, you know, most of the people on here probably know someone with asthma as well. And all of this kind of sprawling development has contributed to asthma rates and all of that kind of thing. But also, we don't think about air pollution as having an impact on our heart health, on cardiovascular disease, but that also is a factor. And then of course, there's the more kind of bread and butter version of what we think of when we think of health and driving versus other types of transportation, which is obesity and diabetes. Because exercise isn't automatically built into our daily lives, this is where we lose a lot of that. And so, unsurprisingly, as our homes have spread out, as we have become more and more reliant on automobiles, we've also gained weight. I guess that's shouldn't be a surprise. The third one that I wanted to mention is climate. I think, I'll just read one short quote from the book that I think kind of summarizes this really well. The more we cover our land with driveways, parking lots, big box buildings, and our sprawling houses, the harder it is for the earth to capture the water. And this is rainwater, by the way. I'm taking an excerpt here. The harder it is for the earth to capture the water for us, instead filling our streets and buildings with it, eventually carrying our pollution into rivers and oceans. A 1 acre parking lot experiences 16 times the stormwater runoff of a 1 acre area that's left natural. And, there's a whole chapter on this. I don't want to get into it, but I think we, again, don't often realize that the way that we build, it's not just, whether we throw the plastic or the glass bottles into the recycling bin versus the trash, that is a much deeper and much more embedded part of our lifestyle that has this impact on the climate around us. And then this last piece is hugely important. It's very relevant to what is going on in today's society and in this year particularly, and that's segregation, both in terms of race and income. And so this was something that I think as I read and researched more for this book became so apparent that I knew that I needed to cover this subject in much greater detail than I thought I would. And, when we look at this American dream and we look at this kind of emphasis on home ownership, it really has been very lopsided in society here. Great example, the home ownership rate for Black families in America is 43%, while it's 73% for white families. That is a huge disparity in America. And not only this, Black families hold less equity in their homes. They face higher rates of housing discrimination even now, and they're more likely to have less favorable mortgage terms than white families, even when you account for income. And so what that last part means is that, for example, during the housing boom of the mid-2000s, if you had two families side by side, one was Black, one was white, but everything else about their finances was the same, the Black family was still more likely to be charged higher interest or otherwise be given a loan that was more likely to go into default if something were to happen to that family's income. And that's all still happening in our current time. So if we know, there's this kind of original American dream that we talk about from the 1930s, and we see that it has an impact, we also know that over the last 20 years, there's been this return to cities. It's also called the Great Inversion is one way of thinking about it. That, as of course, families moved out into the suburbs over the last half century, that over the last 20 years, we've seen a greater number of people moving back into the core of our cities. And this is something that I do in my day-to-day job. I work with developers that want to bring housing particularly, but also office and retail space into downtown or into the neighborhoods that surround downtown. And so, I live this, I see this stuff happening, and I know that this growth is happening in cities across the country and cities of various sizes. It's not just the big cities. It's not the New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Denver. It's not just those places. It's even Des Moines, Waco, Annapolis. I mean, there's all of these places where their downtowns are also seeing this kind of growth of population after they had either stalled or actually lost population. So we know that's not really a secret, but we also know, and we're seeing the data point this out, that the growth that we're seeing is unbalanced. One term that we often see is gentrification. And I think that that's such a loaded term that I shy away from using that term too strictly in the book, because I know for some people, gentrification means one thing, and for other people, it can mean something slightly different. But again, in pockets throughout the country, this growth is uneven, where the desirable close-in neighborhoods are seeing the rent growth and the home price increases that are well above average for the city and potentially also for the country. One example I can think of is I was at a conference in Detroit a few years ago, and the Airbnb that I stayed in was really interesting because if you looked out the front windows of the Airbnb, you could see a Whole Foods and, you know, really nice brand new hospital, just really, you know, nice sidewalks, trees, all of that. But if you looked out the back, all you could see were tons and tons of vacant lots, lots of overgrown grass and weeds, chain link fences. And this was the kind of reality, this dual reality that some cities like Detroit have been facing. But more than these examples of this kind of gentrification or this uneven growth of population and demand for rental and for sale property in these close-knit neighborhoods, we also have learned that concentrated poverty has grown much faster than gentrification since 1970. And so what this means is that neighborhoods that were poor in 1970 are actually poorer today than they were then. And that part tends to get left out of this conversation, that still the vast majority of wealth in our cities is still going away from the core into the suburbs and in many cases neighboring communities around that city. And so what's happened really is this convergence of kind of negative factors. You know, we've seen this preference for suburban living, which saw this wealth sucked out from the inner cities. We saw this domination of private automobiles again, which has led to disinvestment in public transportation. We've seen the resurgence of housing and retail in urban neighborhoods that drives up rent for lower income families. And then we still see public policies, particularly at the federal level, that continue to favor the most wealthy. And so this kind of creates a perfect storm. And so where I want to kind of tie this in is really, what is the role of faith in this conversation in cities? And particularly from the vantage point that I'm speaking of is from the Christian faith. And I think the place I want to start is to say that our lives were really not meant to be lived solely in the private realm. I think we take for granted that so much of our day-to-day life revolves around the self. You know, what do I need to do today? What do I need to accomplish? That we lose sight of the fact that for a vast majority of the people in the world, that's not the paradigm in which they operate. And when I'll bring this in quickly. At the beginning of the book, I actually recall a conversation I had with a friend of mine who is from Zimbabwe. And I was right at the beginning of this process and still thinking about what I wanted to write. And I asked him the question, you know, what would you say is different about community here in the US versus community in Zimbabwe? And he said that when he first came to the US, he was struck by how much everything here revolves around boxes, is kind of the way he describes it. That you sleep in a box that's located in another box that's the rest of your house, and then you go from that box into another box that's on wheels, and then you drive to another box that has a cubicle in it, and that's where you go for 8 hours, and then you go into another box, and then you just kind of rotate this cycle all the way through. Whereas the way that he grew up, in the part of Zimbabwe where he's from, he said everything is about the circle, that even the homes themselves are circular in shape, but they're also oriented in a circular pattern around each other. And, within these villages of multiple homes, you have extended family, that kind of thing. And so you gather in the center of that circle in another circle. And so it's this idea of boxes was so much of a culture shock for him, that it just was kind of a light bulb moment for me in this process. And that was where I really had to step back and think, okay, if I'm going to look at scripture, if I'm going to look at the Bible as a guide for the way that I think about places and about, this connection between how I live and where I live, I need to be thinking about it from that perspective more, because this individual kind of segmented way of life that we have today is actually very foreign to the way that things were at the time that scripture was written. And so when I step back and think of it in those terms, I realize that scripture actually has a lot to say about how our tendency to build places that favor the individual or private wealth over this more community focused way of living. I guess I lost track of my sentence there, but basically that scripture does have a lot to say about that. And so if I can get my slide to go. Yeah, the first verse that I came upon in part of this is Romans 12:9. And depending on the translation that you read, it basically says something along the lines of be sincere in your love for others, and then it continues on. But what the Apostle Paul is saying here is that our love should be genuine. And when we look at the Greek that's used here for love, I'm gonna totally butcher this Greek, so I apologize to anybody who's better at this stuff, but it's agape anhypokritos, which most directly translated means unconditional sacrificial love that is without hypocrisy. So there's actually one Bible commentary that kind of explains this further. I think they do a much better job, so I'll just read it. It says, one who expresses agape love cannot discriminate among who will receive such love and who will not. Agape love describes that love that God has for his creation, one that is not a respecter of persons, or one who does not favor one over another. Christians are to demonstrate unconditional agape love because God is demonstrating the same for them. Agape love cannot hold a grudge. Agape love cannot discriminate against someone based on their social status, whether it be racial, economic, or for any other distinction. And so we look also to Jesus. I think, Jesus is obviously a central figure in the Christian faith. And here in Luke 14, Jesus himself has some choice words for a man that's hosting a dinner party. And this man invited Jesus. And he says to him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. And so this is really, as I continue to see all of these verses about hospitality and love and justice, I realized that unfortunately Christians have really not had the best track record when it comes to addressing the negative impacts of our racial segregation, whether that be in the strictest sense of, Jim Crow laws of, restrooms for one race versus another, but also these impacts that are within the built environment that I talk about in the book, such as white flight, which is that idea that predominantly white middle-class families were leaving the center cities and establishing their families in newer suburbs on the edges of town. But it wasn't even just the passive act of this, it was even an active opposition to efforts to go against that way of thinking. In the mid-20th century, prominent pastors, Christian leaders, they actively opposed efforts to end Jim Crow laws and otherwise promote integration. And as we've seen even this year in 2020, influential leaders in the white evangelical community have spoken out against efforts to dismantle white supremacy by denouncing the Black Lives Matter organization and even calling critical race theory incompatible with faith. And so, yet addressing the racial injustices that persist in our society, whether that be as a result of choices that we made in our built environment or otherwise, I think it requires acknowledging that it exists, recognizing that we can sometimes perpetuate these injustices unknowingly, and then humbly taking steps to enact justice toward others. And so while we continue to hear, well-meaning Christians insist that social justice isn't biblical, I would argue that the Bible has quite a bit to say about it. And so I would just, leave a few more verses before I close. From James 1, we see that, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, and I got to move my camera here. There we go. To visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. In Isaiah 1, we see learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. And then later on in Isaiah 58, is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? In Luke 4, this is an interesting passage because this is actually the first time that we see Jesus in his ministry, and he gets up and addresses his synagogue. And so this is actually also a quote from Isaiah, but I think that what's happening in Luke 4 is really interesting because this is what he says to the people is, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. And he goes on from there, and the congregation in his synagogue is actually upset by the fact that this is what he has to say. And so, I think these words were countercultural during Jesus's time, and they remain countercultural today. And I think the impact of the fact that culture is misaligned with some of this is, again, very apparent in everything from the way our homes are designed and built, where they're built relative to other parts of our communities, and then, of course, how we get around. And, I want to, close by looking at the last chapter of the book and kind of where I talk about rethinking certain aspects of our lives. I try very hard in this book to not prescribe a specific way of life. I didn't want to tell anyone that's reading this book to go move downtown. That was not my goal here. I didn't want to say that suburbs are bad and that if you're a good Christian, you should live in an urban area, because I wholeheartedly just disagree with that, actually. And But I do think that it's important that for each of us that we be deliberate about the choices that we make. And so, I'll just read these really quickly. So the first one is, rethinking your home. And that is really thinking about being more mindful about the choices that we make as a consumer. Do we really need some of the things that we own? Could we do with less in terms of square footage? I say that as someone who literally moved this morning into a bigger space, but there you go. Rethinking your commute. I think for many of us, we underestimate the number of places that we could realistically walk or ride a bike to. And if we legitimately can't do those things, then could we advocate for those to our leaders? Rethinking your neighborhood. Again, same thing, looking at the places that we live and what's around us, and realizing that, could our lives be improved by allowing our places to be more functional rather than everything being so separated from one another? And within that, really, what might it mean for our witness as Christians if we could actually love our neighbors better because of the fact that we've been more deliberate in our choices? Rethinking your church. So this is something I talk about more in depth in the book that I didn't bring up here, but thinking about the suburbanization of churches and how that may or may not allow you to serve the local community better. And so thinking about ways to do that. Rethinking your stuff, which I kind of already talked about, but again, do we need so many one use items or items that only serve one single purpose, or could that be accomplished with something else? And then rethinking our neighbors. This part I think is important. It can feel like a risk to get to know the people around us. And that's true any year. It's true, especially in a pandemic year. But I think, what if we really did risk getting to know the neighbors that are around us, the ones that, maybe have children when we're childless, or vice versa, the ones whose skin color is different from our own, the ones who maybe seem too smart for us. Maybe they're a little smarter than we are. Maybe they have less formal education and you feel like you may not have as much in common. What if you got to know them anyway? The ones who are maybe not as talkative as you are, or the ones that talk too much like I do. The ones that, maybe have more tattoos than you're comfortable with, or maybe seem a little more straight-laced than you would normally associate with. And, I think there's a statement that Jim Wallace makes that I think is so crucial. And that is that there are no non-neighbors in this world. And so when we hear that God says, love your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, what Wallace is arguing here is that legitimately means everyone. And that means people who don't look like you, who don't vote like you, who don't even worship the same God as you do. And, what would our communities look like, or how would they function if we actually thought about them in the way that I bring up in that question at the very beginning, which is, what if it's not just how we live that matters, but also where? And so that's what I would want to leave you with. And with that, I will open up for questions and discussion.
Chris, you had mentioned earlier that you maybe wanted to do a poll. Did you still want to do that? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I just wanted to know from anyone that is watching whether you consider your home to be located in an area that you would call urban, suburban, or rural, or maybe something else. So I think if Scott could help with that.
Oh,
I can
yeah.
do it.
Or Drew? Okay.
So what are the options?
So would you consider your home to be urban, suburban, or rural, or something else?
So while we're working on that, I do have there's a Q&A here. Actually, I'll just read it. It's from Jacob. If there was one change you could make to the American development practices, what would it be?
Wow, that is such a big question. There are so many things I could do, but I think probably where I would start is to really, as a nation, really invest more in housing the American poor. I think that, we have no shortage of actual housing in the US, but we do have very much a mismatch of housing between what's available and what people can afford. And I think that if we could really address that in a more wholesale way, I think that that would make a huge difference. And where I see that working particularly well is in places like Prague or Vienna, I can't remember which, where I think the government actually owns like 25% of all the housing in the city. And that's done intentionally to make sure that very few people don't have an opportunity to find housing that they can actually afford.
I have a question for you. How do you think that what people are experiencing now with basically sort of like being at home all the time will change like development patterns, or like where and if not development patterns, like where people will choose to buy their homes, or that real estate developers would be more inclined to include amenities and commercial development within a suburban footprint? Because I know that I guess, I live in a small town, but I live in an urban neighborhood, and I can walk just about everywhere I need to go. And so, COVID and being, quarantined has been difficult, as it is for everyone, but it's been less difficult because I can go, everywhere I need to go safely and easily, but also feel like, when I leave the house, I'm not just walking around my cul-de-sac, that if I just want to go for a walk, I can feel like I actually go somewhere. So my question was short at the beginning and then I made it long.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think that there are multiple factors at play that people are thinking about now that we've gone through this year, right? I think there's the internal piece about the space that we have and whether that's adequate for this new lifestyle that we're living. I think, I've heard that some people were already questioning this tendency toward very open concept housing, this idea that the living, dining, kitchen, is all one single giant room. I think that now in this age of this bleed over of school and work and daily life, that people are starting to realize this is not really ideal. Like, I need a separate space to be able to do the things that I need to do now on a daily basis, especially if work from home continues to be a norm for particularly the white collar workforce. And so I think for those that have the ability to be in the housing market in the future, they're going to be thinking a lot more about the functionality of the floor plan in the event that people are home at the same time, all trying to accomplish different things. So that's one. And then thinking about the outside of the home, I think we saw all those viral videos, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, before it had really spread a lot in the US, where, you know, people in Italy were out on their balconies and singing songs together and really just trying to make the most of quarantine, and realizing like we are, as a species, really starving for quality outdoor space that we can enjoy and still be social, but also have a little bit of kind of that semi-privacy. The way I, you know, liken it in another conversation I had is really that the front porch is kind of that perfect kind of middle ground here in our own building typology, right? So, you know, you've got the sidewalk, which is the public realm, and of course you have the inside of your house, which is private, but that porch is kind of that perfect middle ground where you can still safely interact and socialize with your neighbors. And so I do think that there's a real opportunity in the development space to really be rethinking, going back to that model for housing and finding a way to maybe de-emphasize car storage as much. Maybe there's a way that architects can work on addressing both people's, you know, inherent, at least need in the current context to be able to have a vehicle and have it stored, but also still provide that sociability in a housing type that people still seem to demand. But I do think your point about more the form of communities themselves, I think, you know, we're seeing, at least down here in San Antonio, that, you know, there were a lot of people that thought, no, San Antonians will never want to eat outside in the summer because it's just too hot. I mean, Scott, you know this, you lived here, is easily over 100 degrees for weeks at a time. And so the thought of ever wanting to eat food outside just seems totally nuts. But this year, you know, we found ourselves during kind of the height of the pandemic in the summer, really just trying to think like, where can we get out of this house, but still do it safely? And that really, we realized how limited we actually were in places that had great outdoor seating, that had shade and all of those things. And so, you know, we're seeing in a lot of cities where they're actually temporarily shutting down streets to be able to allow people to be outdoors more safely, to be able to distance themselves, that kind of thing. But also seeing a lot of street space converted either temporarily or permanently to dining space, so that these restaurants that, you know, their interiors may have felt safe a year ago, that's not really working. And so having the need to be able to go outside. And, you know, I realize there's probably also a temperature differential between Kansas and San Antonio in December. There are definitely days where it's pretty easy to still be outdoors, sometimes even in short sleeves. But I don't remember if I answered all of your question there.
Yeah, you answered it well enough. So, but I was sort of, when you were talking, I was sort of thinking about sort of like new urbanism and that pattern of development, which is much more front porch oriented in their style, and then with, you know, limited commercial within the development, but still sort of largely like exurban. You know, there are obviously a lot of people who are never going to move into the city, but a pattern like, you know, a new urban sort of development pattern would maybe be a good mix. You know, just allow people to be sociable, but still have a sort of single family.
Yeah, and I do think another aspect that has become really apparent is not just the house itself or even the retail that people go to, but also those recreational spaces, I think, are hugely important. And the way that different cities have handled outdoor space has been really kind of interesting. It's been all across the board. I mean, you've got stories of, New York City where they closed down all their parks for a while, and, but people were still on the sidewalks and they're still trying to figure this all out. And then, here we have a great trail system in San Antonio. And, when the weather was really ideal, especially in those morning and evening hours, they were very crowded. And I think that really, to me, is a signal that we need a lot more of that space and not less. And so that's, again, I think something that's going to be more of an opportunity than maybe it appeared to be in previous years. And, there was never as much, I think, a desire to live on a trail, but I think that could change. I'd be interested to know.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay.
Are you able to see any questions that might pop up on Facebook?
Ooh.
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions come up on Facebook, but I have been monitoring.
Okay.
So I do have another question for you, Chris, and this
Okay.
is more. So it seems like in sort of like the middle part of this past century that like neighborhood churches and so like local parishes were much more of a thing, that especially in like the Catholic faith, that the kids went to the local Catholic school, and that definitely doesn't seem to be the case anymore. That, as you were mentioning, sort of like choosing your church, that it seemed like in a way that like you chose your church and you chose your neighborhood. But now, you can live in a neighborhood on one side of town and go to church on the other side of town. Yeah. And I'm wondering sort of how like the growth of larger churches and the disappearance of smaller neighborhood-based churches has impacted your thinking, on this topic of faith in cities and being better neighbors.
It has. and to be fair, a lot of what I wrote about churches in this book, I would say I've thought a lot about it even more since then. And so I think even if I were going to rewrite that chapter, I would probably do some things differently. And I don't want to say that the chapter is irrelevant or that it is outdated, but I do think that I've had more time to think about the sizes of churches and the ways that they function, and it is difficult. I saw an article that was, after this was already pretty much wrapping up. I believe Jonathan Merritt was the one that published it, and talks about the number of churches that are closing, and this was all pre-pandemic, that I forget the number, like 3,000 churches or something are closing every year in the US. And the vast majority, I think, of those churches are the really small congregations, less than a couple hundred people. Whereas, down here in the South, especially, we're seeing these larger mega churches that seem to be weathering the storm quite well. And what does that mean, when we have these really large churches and, like you said, these older neighborhood churches, and are they struggling, and how do they deal with that? And one of the questions I tried to explore was whether, which method is better. Is a small church better, or is a big church better? And it really depends. I think for me, the ultimate question is, does the church facilitate community and discipleship in a meaningful way? And I absolutely think that it can happen in churches that are above 1,000 people. And, I do think that maybe that can sometimes be facilitated better in smaller churches, but I've also seen small churches do that really poorly. And so I think that it really does depend on the priorities and the heart of the people in leadership in that congregation. And so where I do think there is a disparity, it is the same, I think, between, you know, high wealth and low wealth families. I think we see the same thing play out in churches. You know, you've got these larger churches that have whole parking lot teams, like there's a whole parking lot ministry kind of section in these bookstores that are dedicated to this kind of thing. So there's a whole gathering of resources for people who have these large facilities to manage and operate. And, you know, it takes a tremendous amount of resource, and by resource, of course, I mean dollars, to be able to keep a facility like that functioning. And so in some ways, a large church needs to be large in order to stay large. And a small church doesn't need as much to stay afloat, but it does need people to be faithful to that congregation. And, you know, certainly as we see the shift in religious affiliation in America, I think that is where we're seeing the biggest hit, because as the small churches close down, I think a lot of those congregants either don't go to church at all after that, or they tend to go to a larger church. I don't actually know that for sure, but that's kind of my own anecdotal evidence, I think.
Okay, cool. And then we have one last question. Where can someone buy your book?
Great question. Yeah, so a couple of places. You know, I've really tried to promote buying from local bookstores. So if you go to a local bookstore's website near you and type in Faith in Cities, you should be able to find it there. If not, you can go to bookshop.org, and they can either help you find the book at a local bookstore near you, or if you buy from them, they actually distribute the proceeds to local bookstores across the country to help keep them afloat. But if you prefer Kindle, or if you just love Prime shipping like I do, you can get it on Amazon. And so that is also an option. So it is in paperback and Kindle.
Well, and for those of us in Lawrence, it looks like Drew has posted a link to the Raven, which is one of our favorite local bookshops.
They will ship nationally for, I believe, $3 too. So,
Oh.
And it's free delivery in Lawrence if you buy online.
Yeah, actually, you know what? If you buy it, I'll go down and pick it up for you.
Okay.
Great.
Same for you.
Great. Cool. Well, unless I mean that's probably it. So, great. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
and for coming on.
Thank you. So it's my pleasure. I'm glad could jump on. And again, if you want to keep the conversation going, I think Twitter is the easiest way to do that. At CR Lazaro.
Great. Well, we'll see you on Twitter then.
Bye. Yeah, I see Drew put it in the chat. It's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.